the nation, so now the Attorney General will investigate the president's campaign fundraising. Attorney General Janet Reno decided yesterday to open a preliminary review of the president's campaign fundraising. The objective, to decide whether an independent counsel should undertake a formal investigation. This just a few days after ordering similar steps in regard to the vice president's activities. For months now, the Attorney General has resisted taking such steps. Why has she suddenly reversed course? And what does the Senate intend to do about campaign reform legislation? After a falling out between the Republican and Democratic Senate leaders Friday, the answer may be nothing. We'll talk about all of that with Connecticut Democrat Joe Lieberman and Mississippi Republican Thad Cochran, two key senators on the Senate committee probing campaign fundraising irregularities. Then we'll shift the focus to the other big story of the week, the tobacco settlement proposed by the president. We'll have a roundtable on that with two key players, Mississippi Attorney General Mike Moore and Minnesota Attorney General Hubert Skip Humphrey. Gloria Borger will have the real deal on the juiciest fight in Washington last week, and I'll have a final thought on the most famous letter to the editor ever written to an American newspaper. But first, what's going on with the Attorney General and the campaign finance investigation on Face the Nation.
Face the Nation with Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
And good morning again. We start this morning in Jackson, Mississippi with Senator Thad Cochran. Here in Washington, Senator Joseph Lieberman. Gloria Borger, of course, joins in the questioning. And the first thing we want to talk about is this announcement from the Attorney General yesterday that, yes, indeed, she is going to take the preliminary steps to see if a special counsel should be appointed to look into the president's fundraising activities. Senator Cochran, you have been very critical of the Attorney General over these past weeks. One senator told me the other day that Congress feels that she's simply been giving them the runaround. Do you think she's now done the right thing, and is this enough?
I think there has been a very unfortunate delay by this Attorney General and her Department of Justice in coming to grips with the reality of the charges that have been made against high-level officials in this administration. And now to say that there's going to be a 30-day review to determine whether there will be a 90-day preliminary inquiry to decide if there is evidence that implicates high-level officials in the administration's illegal conduct campaign financing scheme, I think indicates that she is way behind the curve. We need some more aggressive action, some stronger leadership, and I frankly think the Attorney General should resign. We have a body of evidence that's already in our hearing record that clearly shows the White House was used at the President's own suggestion for sleepovers at the White House to reward fundraisers and those who would contribute to the party, not just phone calls, but fundraisers as in the form of coffees where targets for the amounts of money that would be raised for the Democratic Party were indicated on sheets that were signed off on by the President. These are things that, to me, suggest that certainly there should be an independent counsel appointed, but not just a 30-day review.
Well, we didn't have to wait long to get some news from you this morning, Senator Cochran. I mean, saying the Attorney General should resign, that's a pretty strong statement there.
Well, it's been clearly obvious from the testimony we've had just this week. We had an entire segment on the White House coffees, and the President and other officials in the administration knew what they were for. There were specific sums of money indicated on memoranda from Harold Ickes to a lot of people. The President has his fingerprints all over those documents. And on the call sheets that were to go to the President and Vice President suggesting specific people to call from the White House to raise money, one said that, Mr. President, you should tell this person the funds that she will contribute will be used in your campaign. This was to the President. The Attorney General had earlier said the calls were to be made to raise money for party building and therefore it wasn't illegal. That's an example of a clear illegal act. And she's going to undertake a 30-day review to see if there should be a 90-day preliminary inquiry, to see if there's any evidence. There is ample evidence in the record of our committee.
All right, well, let me just ask you, just for the record here, could she do this more quickly than to go through this process?
Well, I think we can look back to October of '96. That's almost a year ago. So
what you're saying is
evidence has been in the public domain. It is a part of our hearing record. I think it's ridiculous to continue to drag it out. And I think she doesn't have, I don't know whether it is the attitude about what her role is, but she continues to find excuses and makes promises for restructuring the investigation. That's not a substitute for action.
All right.
Do you, Senator Lieberman, do you agree with Senator Cochran? You think the Attorney General should resign, that she has no credibility?
No, I strongly disagree. I think the suggestion that she should resign, or the even more irresponsible suggestion a while ago that she should be impeached, is very unfair, and it comes from a characteristically fair colleague of mine, Thad Cochran. The fact is that the Attorney General is not a politician. She's a law officer. You're going to have two Attorneys General on in a while. I was an Attorney General. She's doing what she concludes the law requires her to do. Thad Cochran mentioned a series of events. We've had others at our hearing. There's a difference between what's wrong and what may be illegal, and that's what the independent counsel statute calls on her to do. Only when one of the small number of covered individuals, including the president or vice president, may have committed a criminal act, is she supposed to begin the inquiry?
Well, you're a Democrat now. Do you endorse the idea of her doing this? Do you think an independent counsel ought to be elected?
Well, I certainly support exactly what she has done, because there is now evidence. She made a judgment about the vice president in regard to these calls, that there was enough evidence to justify an inquiry to see whether an independent counsel should be appointed. The same is now true of the president. She took the initiative on her own. Nobody pushed her on this particular point. I think she's done the right thing, and she'll follow it through as a lawyer, not a political crony or politician.
Well, as a lawyer who has been sitting at all these hearings, do you think that the investigation ought to be broadened? Right now it seems that it's limited to the president and the vice president's fundraising telephone calls. You heard what Senator Cochran was talking about, the coffees at the White House, et cetera, et cetera. Should it be broadened?
I think those coffees were wrong. I think they were part of a pattern.
They illegal?
No, and I don't see evidence that they were illegal, and that's why I don't believe at this point on the evidence the Attorney General had any reason to broaden the pursuit of whether an independent counsel should be appointed. She's a law officer. The independent counsel law is very tight. Look, I said earlier in our investigation, I think when we look back at 1996, we're going to find that the biggest scandals were legal. And what we ought to be doing is making them illegal. One of the things we ought to make illegal is the use of the White House for any kind of fundraising related activities. We ought to protect future presidents and vice presidents from the kind of pressure that led our president and vice president to do some of the things they did.
Let me shift this just a bit, because I want to ask both of you about something that happened last week that sort of got swept up in the maw of all this investigation. And that is that Senator Specter went to the floor and he criticized the Attorney General. He said the FBI has known for some time that a certain businessman out in California, that they had some evidence he may have actually been a conduit for money coming in from the Chinese government that went in to various campaigns. Number one, do you agree with what he said? Is in fact that true? And where does that lead?
Okay, Bob, it's tough to talk about this because this is supposed to be classified information, but of course the morning after we have the classified briefing, it appears in the newspaper. Let me just try to put it this way generally. Throughout all the briefings our committee has received from the intelligence community, indicating what I have concluded is evidence that somewhere in the Chinese government there was a plan to get money into our elections to influence our policy. This gentleman's name was mentioned, so that's not new. What was new is an additional piece of evidence about this California businessman, which was not given to the committee earlier. But I must tell you that my conclusion was that that evidence was not given to the committee not as part of a cover-up, it was a screw-up. And it's part of what made the Attorney General angry enough to rearrange the people running the independent investigation.
Does the information convince you, though, that this man may have indeed been a conduit from the Chinese government and there was a plan by the Chinese to sort of get involved in our campaigns in some way?
It leads me to conclude, not on a legal basis that one could take to court at this point, that that is probably so.
All right. What about you,
right.
Senator Cochran, your analysis of that?
Well, I think it supports the statement that our chairman, Fred Thompson, made when the hearings first began, that the investigation had produced evidence which showed that there was a plan that involved China and its government officials getting involved in the American political process more aggressively, and that there was evidence that that plan was carried out. Now, the exact so-called hard evidence that the press keeps asking about is circumstantial. There are inferences that have to be drawn from facts that we've been given, but I support what our chairman has said, and those briefings that we received recently also support that statement.
Well, Senators, let me ask you, and I'll start with Senator Lieberman. Now we're heading into a phase of the hearings in the Senate on campaign finance reform. All of this is supposed to lead to some kind of campaign finance reform. There was a fight this week in the Senate over that. Senator Lieberman first. Do you think we will get a vote on a serious campaign finance bill this year?
Yes, we will.
And will it pass?
Well, that's another question. That's great news. And you know, the people have criticized these hearings, said they're partisan, whatever. But without these hearings, I don't think we'd be where we are today with the leaders of the Senate arguing not about whether we'll take up campaign finance reform, but when we'll take it up. And I think we've generated the momentum to make that happen.
Well, Senator Cochran, your own leader, Senator Lott, won't set a specific date on starting the debate on this issue. Do you think there's going to be a vote on this?
I think he's reserving the right to make a decision the majority leader only can make, and that is when to schedule the debate. I don't think he wants to be pushed into a certain date now by the Democrats.
Will it happen?
I think he will. I think he will schedule a debate. I think we will and should have a debate on this issue. And there are other alternatives, not just the McCain-Feingold bill. Senator Specter has a bill. Senator John Warner, the chairman of our Rules Committee, will have a bill. I think there will be alternatives that ought to be considered on this issue.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for the information. I think we made some news here this morning.